Thank you, Mr. Chairman, comrades and friends and opponents. My opponent has come here this evening in order to perform what can only be regarded as a rather morbid task. She has come to convince you that you should be prepared to die for Britain. Now, indeed, this fatal course of action is not just the obscene product of my opponent's imagination. The practical acceptance by the major governments of the world of military policies which could lead to the annihilation of millions of human lives leaves every one of us as a candidate, whether we support our opponent or do not, for the mass human wreckage which a future world war would most certainly produce. So we should be in no doubt at the outset that whether we agree that Britain is worth dying for or not, if things go on as they do, every one of us in this hall are the potential victims. To accept my opponent's proposition is to do more than to offer a dull nod of the head towards the idiocies of nationalist rhetoric. That in itself is harmless. To accept that Britain is worth dying for is to enter with complacency into the belief that natural resources and human energies must be squandered upon an unprecedented campaign of preparation for war. To accept the military status quo is to do nothing to change a world which can produce 4 tons of explosive per head of the global population at the same time as a third of the world's population are starving, 30 million a year at the rate of the equivalent of 1 Hiroshima every 2 days. And to go along with my opponent is to follow her into a barbaric line of reasoning which regards violence and ultimately the sacrifice of human life as the most efficient means of resolving conflict. As a socialist, I stand in total and uncompromising hostility to the proposition that Britain, or indeed any other country, is worth dying for. It is my intention then to convince you that the workers of the world have no country, either to be loyal to during life or to sacrifice ourselves for in war. For the workers of the world have got far more in common with each other, whatever may be written on our passports, than we will ever have with those who call upon us to die for the sake of their greed, plunder, and imperial ambition. So let me make the position of the Socialist Party plain right at the outset. It is our view that every worker whose life is lost in the great scramble for profits has wasted his or her life. That every drop of workers' blood which is shed for the sake of nationalism is a stain upon the present social order. And that stain can only be removed by removing this social order. My opponent, in the spirit of the perverse Orwellian logic which was dominating capitalism long before 1984, tells you that we need bombs to preserve peace. If you want peace, according to her ladyship, prepare for war. The socialist answer to that logic is very simple, so simple that it has perhaps escaped my opponent's thought process. If you want peace, you prepare for peace. And the only way that you can prepare for peace is by eradicating the cause of war. And I propose to show that the cause of war lies within the present capitalist system of society, whether it is a private capitalism of the West or the state capitalism of the East. My purpose is to convince you that a social system which is geared to rivalry over control of the world market and ruthless competition between antagonists over the market is not a system which causes war by accident. It is a system which causes war as a matter of inevitability. I shall argue then that the world capitalist system, together with its nations, its flags, its armies, its torture chambers, and the equipment supplied for them by British and other governments, must be thrown onto the scrap heap of historical anachronisms. And in its place, we've got to establish a system of society based upon need and not profit, and upon the cultivation of life, rather than the hideous preparation for death. So I'm arguing against nationalism, because I've got no country, and for socialism, because I've got a world to win. And let me say right at the outset, to those who protest as they sing the words of the International to the tunes of the national anthem, that nationalism and socialism are not compatible. You have to have one or the other. And in arguing against nationalism and for socialism, I am very much aware of the conspicuous absence this evening of two groups of people at this debate. Firstly, there are those who have lost their lives because their minds were captured by the infectious illusion of nationalism. They were convinced that it was our duty to go out and fight. The 30 million who died between 1914 and 1918 in what was laughably called a war to end all wars. And after they fought and died to end all wars, then millions more went out, backed up by those great democratic allies, Churchill and Stalin, to fight a war that was meant to be for freedom and democracy. And then there are the young men driven by the frustration of the dole queue and perhaps even the hope of a certain amount of adventure in the possibility of legalised gang warfare, who joined the army and the navy. They joined it for a bit of adventure, and what did they see? They saw the bottom of the South Atlantic. The workers in uniform who were blown to pieces in the Falklands War, so that the leader of my opponent's party could build an image of iron strength upon the wasted corpses of young men out in the South Atlantic. Was Britain worth dying for them? Would they be cheering so passionately at the rhetoric of nationalism if they had their chance over again? The millions of soldiers whose wasted corpses stand as a grotesque symbol of patriotism are not here to know that they died in vain. They died as pawns in a game of political and commercial rivalry which had nothing at all to do with their human interests. But there are others who have survived, and if my opponent wants to learn, she should listen to them. The men and women who fought in 2 world wars to defend a madhouse called civilization, who are now existing on a pittance of a pension, and 10,000 of them last winter died for Britain, not because there was a war on. They died of hypothermia, because having gone out and fought and been injured, and given their energies to fight for a country which they mistakenly believed was theirs. They couldn't even afford to switch on a heater, and they died. And my opponent should go and talk to workers who've come back from wars without limbs, with brain damage, with half their skin burnt off. And now that those ruined lives have been thrown onto the scrap heap of what are called the disabled, how many of them are counting their increased share dividends in Charrington Coalite, who own most of the Falkland Islands? How many of them are going out and investing their millions in the markets which they help to expand? Before my opponent and those like her indulge in the dangerous rhetoric of nationalism, let them remember that behind every flag-waving, slogan-chanting display of patriotism lies the reality of a military technology which grows more lethal as the capitalist requirement for profits becomes more voracious. And there's a second group of people who are not here tonight. The infants, the babies, the children, the potentially innocent victims who are the sitting targets of my opponent's bombs for peace. Nobody will ask them whether Britain is worth dying for. Nobody asks their parents whether they are prepared to sacrifice their children for the sake of their master's quarrels. If my opponent is asked to tell us, why do we have to have war? And if we argue it out for long enough, I think that it will come down to two words. And these are two of the most pernicious words in the political vocabulary. Human nature. All of the guns and the bombs, all of the concentration camps, these are a reflection of human nature. That's what they say. But is this so? Is it true that children are born with an innate propensity to hate enemies? I put it to my opponent that humans are born with a need to cooperate, not to fight, and that it is the present social order which needs to indoctrinate workers to believe that they've got enemies, which needs to drive it into our heads that these are your enemies today, and when your bosses have made a trade alliance with them, they're your friends tomorrow. Is it true that babies in cots in China have got some kind of inborn animosity towards babies in cots in Russia because Khrushchev fell out with Chairman Mao about 30 years ago? Is it true that Iranian and Iraqi children have got this natural hatred for each other? And is it true that our uniquely human rationality can allow us no better than to mature into thugs who can only solve our problems by maintaining a permanent threat of global destruction? Socialists reject entirely the conservative dogma that human behaviour is fixed into the mould of aggression and non-cooperation. The fact is that that aggression, that hatred, that nationalism is driven in to workers' minds against their better judgments at childhood. Why is it then that the present system of capitalism leads to war? Well, to answer this, we need to understand a few things about the system. To begin with, let's be quite clear. Capitalism does not exist in order to satisfy human needs. That is a myth. It exists in order to make profits for a minority, and if that minority cannot expect a profit, then humans are deprived of the satisfaction of basic needs. The chief object of the capitalist is to sell commodities on the market with a view to profit. And they will do this without any concern about ideology. Russia and South Africa fix a price of gold in quite happy trade collaboration every single day of the week. The United States and China are major trade partners, and Britain quite prepared to trade with any of the people who are its alleged ideological enemies. In short, the race for profits goes on without ideology getting in the way. The patriotic garbage is put on show for the consumption of the working class. But I can assure you that the Swiss bank account class, the class which has had a massive transfer of capital to where labour power is cheaper and they can get a higher rate of profit, they certainly aren't concerned about such absurd sentiments as patriotism. So by and large, capitalist trade goes on without war. Periodically, however, the thieves fall out. And it's at that point that capitalist competition over markets, over trade routes, and over raw materials erupts into a parade of violence. And at such times, huge fortunes are spent on whipping up popular emotions of national chauvinism and hatred for the enemy. Millions of pounds are spent on showing the working class that the Russians are our enemies. Russians who we wouldn't know if we met them. That the Argies can't be trusted. Remember that? It's not so much in the press these days. And then, with utter cynicism, the rival capitalist states dress our wage slaves in uniform, pay the priests to bless the bombs, and having persuaded those with nothing to gain except a grave, there proceeds the legalised and morally sanctified killing of thousands or hundreds of thousands, or in the case of the war that awaits us, many millions of people. And let us be under no illusion, whatever the rhetorical justifications of the capitalists, those wars are fought for one reason: commercial gain. And in their more honest moments, which in the case of the present Minister of Defence hasn't yet occurred, they've said this. The capitalists have come out in the open and admitted that what the wars are all about is making a profit. Let me give you some examples. In 1890, Joseph Chamberlain, a Conservative government minister, confirmed precisely what I as a socialist have been saying in a speech to the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce. Now, he must have been telling the truth there. No one tells lies in the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce. And he said, all the great offices of state are occupied with commercial affairs. The Foreign Office and the Colonial Office are chiefly engaged in finding new markets and defending old ones. The War Office and the Admiralty are mostly occupied in the defence of these markets and for the protection of our commerce. And those whose relatives were killed fighting for Britain out in India, they'd be interested to hear what the Conservative Home Secretary in 1925, Lord Brentford, had to say about that. I quote, "We did not conquer India for the benefit of the Indians. I know it is said at missionary meetings that we conquered India to raise the level of the Indians. That is cant. We conquered India as the outlet for the goods of Great Britain. Again in 1939, my opponent might tell us that the war was fought to defend noble principles of democratic rights and fighting against Nazism. And I would be very interested if my opponent would tell me how much he agrees with the comment made in the open letter written by Churchill in the Daily Telegraph before the Second World War, when he wrote, I quote, "I have always said that if Britain were defeated in war, I hope that we should find a Hitler to lead us back to our rightful position among the nations." Unquote. Was it then a war for democracy and for freedom, for human rights? Or was not the position more accurately summed up by the Conservative Minister of Overseas Trade in March 1939, when he said, "We are not going to give up any markets to anyone. Great Britain is strong enough to fight for markets abroad." That was what they fought for. And as a final quotation in support of the socialist analysis, and you'll notice that none of these come from these so-called rabid Marxists, all from my opponent's side. Let me quote from Smedley D. Butler. I mean, he must be from my opponent's side. He was a former Major General in the United States Marine Corps. And he wrote, "I served in all commissioned ranks from a second lieutenant to Major General. And during that period, I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism." Major General in the United States Marine Corps in his own autobiography. And that is what they want us to die for. Now, my opponent might say we should be prepared to die to defend what is ours. Well, what is ours? Let's take a look at what is ours, and let's take a look at what ain't ours. Only 7% of the British population own any marketable stocks and shares. Not my figures, Inland Revenue 1980 report. 93% of the British population own no stocks and shares which they can sell. I know we're meant to all be on pension funds which you get when you die. Well, that's not quite enough. The poorest 80% of the British population, according to the Royal Commission report of 1979, said that the poorest 80% of the British population own less of the accumulated wealth than the richest 1%. Just 1% own more of Britain than 80% with everything we possess added together. A mere 2% of the British population own 64% of the land in this country. And I could carry on quoting statistics. Not our statistics, their statistics. I could carry on quoting them all night. But I don't have to do that to prove that workers have got no economic stake in capitalism. You know, without me having to tell you, that when they talk about defending our markets, they're not talking about Chapel Street Market. When they talk about defending our property, they're not talking about our rented video machines and the second-hand Cortina. Don't think they are. You'd need a pea shooter to defend that. The fact of the matter, Mr. Chairman, is that if the Russians sent an aeroplane over to Britain to rob from the working class what belongs to us, it'd cost them more in petrol fuel than they'd pick up in the whole of Islington. And let me just say this, that when I read in the Daily Telegraph, and I read the Daily Telegraph, and I just hope she reads the Socialist Standard, When I read the Prime Minister's New Year message to the nation, it was printed in the Reader's Digest, a famous intellectual journal, and she says, liberty and property are intricately bound up in our history. A country that has no property rights has no human rights. And I respond to that by saying that when property is concentrated into the hands of a parasitical minority, whether they are millionaire shareholders or whether they are state bureaucrats in the Kremlin, then it is fraudulent in the extreme to suggest that to die for property is to die for our liberty. So my opponent will just have to concede that if workers are to die for Britain, we'll be dying for their Britain, not for our Britain. And then, of course, there is the argument that we should be prepared to die to defend our way of life, our culture. Now, I must admit that I find it very odd to imagine that cruise missiles have been brought to Britain in order to defend the collected works of Shakespeare against a preemptive strike from the Pushkin Appreciation Society. Of course, workers don't have a way of life to defend. Why should we die in defence of McDonald's hamburgers and Dallas for us and the Ritz Hotel on Ascot for them, when instead there's a greater task before us to create a society where all people have free access to the best goods and services which human endeavour can provide? Why not put that as our aim? And imagine for a moment if these obscene weapons of destruction were used. Would they be defending our way of life? Would they be defending this so-called civilization? In the Stockton Evening Gazette on the 12th of August last year, I read a report, and this is one of many illustrations of how these bombs for peace are going to defend our way of life. I quote, "A doctor is recommending that victims of a nuclear attack should be stoned to death to put them out of their misery. Dr. Barney Williams that is, has produced a controversial 10-point survival plan which he has been handing to patients at his surgery. Survivors are advised that the best treatment for people dying in pain is a crack on the head with a large stone." Well, that should certainly be within the government's projected budget for the NHS. Of course, mass destruction will not defend life or culture or human dignity, and I challenge my opponent, and I think the onus is upon her to do it, to show us how it will. But I know that my opponent might say one other thing, and as I'm moving towards the closing remarks, let me comment on it. I know there are a few gullible people around who will accept the point that it's the Russians. We've got to defend ourselves against all these Russians and all these Poles. Well, we like them sometimes, but not all the time. We've got to defend ourselves against them. And there are a few people who actually believe in the rhetoric. They believe that the dictators in Russia are socialist dictators. They believe that the Russian bombs are bombs for liberation. And in falling for this mythology, as many Russian workers have done, and I've spoken to many who have, they have been taken in no less than workers in any other country by the myth that you can support your own interests by supporting the needs of profit. And there are propagandists in Russia, just like my opponent, whose task is to whip up nationalist feeling in the interests of imperial expansion. As a matter of fact, they're not just like my opponent. I was actually reading a speech by one the other day. It's got the same name as my opponent. or half of it. She's called Olga Grebenovich. I mean, you disagree with the Ben bit, I know. And it struck me just how ideologically hollow and how dangerous this rhetoric is, wherever it comes from and in whatever language it is uttered. Somebody has suggested to me that we might be able to start up a multilateral comedy show called The Two Olgas, guaranteed to die laughing. But anyway, I want to conclude on this, that there is an alternative. It's no good just saying what we don't want. There is an alternative. To abolish the system which needs to sacrifice people for profits. To establish a society in which the resources of the world belong to the inhabitants of the world. And why, in a society which is based on common ownership and democratic control, where the world at last belongs to the people who, in a democracy, it's got to belong to, its inhabitants. Why would people then want to go to war when you've got rid of the institutions of property, when you've got rid of the institution of the market and of profits and of all of the socially anachronistic features of capitalism? In conclusion, I would urge my opponent to remember two things. Firstly, the Socialist Party is not concerned to oppose one weapon as opposed to another. As far as we are concerned, the rubber bullet on the streets of Belfast is just as obnoxious as the cruise missile. The SS-20, the Exocet, the chemical and biological weapons, whoever controls them, whoever's finger is on the button, we are against them all. They must all be removed by removing that which is their cause. And secondly, let me remind my opponent that the Socialist Party is not appealing to capitalist governments of either side to disarm unilaterally or multilaterally. The futility of expecting governments to run a system of ruthless competition without the most hideous violence is like petitioning muggers to extract money from their victims by means of gentle persuasion. It can't happen. There are those who think you can run capitalism peacefully. There are those who think that you can civilise warfare. The Socialist Party rejects those ideas. And that is why, because my opponent's arguments are so much part of the perverse logic of capitalism, you've got to make an important and urgent choice. Will you surround yourselves with the means of destruction in the false hope that the reason for their creation will not lead to the reason for their use? Or will you organise politically and consciously to establish a society where the missiles are in the museums and we can all listen to tapes of Lady Olga Maitland and we'll be able to say, it's lucky we learnt in time?
Right, thank you. I now call upon Lady Olga Maitland to respond to that argument.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity today to come to respond to Mr. Coleman. He said many comments which give me cause for laughter when you were intentionally humorous, and you made comments which caused me anxiety for the sake of us all. First of all, may I say that I sympathise with everyone who who fears the threat of a world destruction. Now, I agree with you. It is a morbid task to say, are you prepared to die without any principles? Because I think that is really what you're trying to say. You're talking about mass human wreckage, a future world war, which in fact you don't even know could happen in the way that you envisage. You talk about human resources being squandered. You talk about should we sacrifice our life as the most efficient means of solving conflict. But, Mr. Chairman, there is one thing that I must remind you. As a very proud member and holder of my British passport, I will say emphatically yes, I would die for Britain. And I believe all those who have died in generations behind me have felt it was worth their sacrifice. War is an emotive subject. We all know that. The question we want to ask ourselves is, why do we actually go to war? I will mention one fact which Mr. Coleman seems to have totally forgotten in his speech. He forgot to mention the fact that we, the people of Great Britain, pride ourselves on those most precious words in the English language: freedom, liberty, democracy. Britain has always been proud to defend itself. It has never opted out. You could not, in years go by, force a man to fight if he wouldn't. He could just stop. He could just lay down his gun. You can have conscription, but you can't force him to throw that bullet. The fact is, throughout all the wars throughout history, in Britain, we have defended ourselves as a nation, all types, all social classes. And I may say, may I remind you, Mr. Coleman, I am a member of the working class because I have a salaried job like other people. All types, all economic conditions, soldiers and officers go to war. They don't ask each other which party do they support in the ballot box. They go to war because of what they really care about is their freedom of their country. And their country has been intimidated and is in danger of being overrun. I agree with you that wars start really for the reasons of power, and that is human nature. It happens with animals. An animal in the jungle will kill another animal.
You are animals, we're not.
Wars happen because people, as in fact even Mr. Coleman mentioned, they scrabble for mineral resources, trade routes. They also seek to press their own cultures and their own philosophical doctrinations. Communism is the problem that we face today. And the great threat to us, as we stand in this room, is that we face a very tense time in 1984. We have the world leaders in Stockholm arguing a war of words. And let us hope and pray that restraint by deterrent will control things until we can really bring true reason. But the fact is we have a very strong potential enemy, and that is the Soviets, with their expansionist philosophy. And we have to face the fact that unless we show we have a moral fibre and a willingness to defend ourselves, there will not be this great country of Great Britain. And I stress the word Great Britain. If we don't show we have this resolution, if we don't show strength, they will impose upon us the same kind of treatment they've imposed upon those people of Afghanistan, gassed, weak and helpless, aeroplanes flying over their heads daily, strapping villagers who don't even have a gun between 3 or 4 people. In fact, the Soviet Union has spread their own philosophies, their own manpower, their own resources, personnel, equipment, into 56 different countries in the world. Many countries have been totally unwilling recipients of Soviet invasion. I name, of course, those who have been now incorporated into the Warsaw Pact: Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, which we see regularly on television. People fighting for freedom. That, Mr. Kuhlman, is what we treasure. And for those who have lost freedom, know how precious it is. And Britain is a country which must show that we have the resolution to defend ourselves, because we are a vital piece of real estate in Europe. We are the cornerstone of NATO. And if we're not careful, the communists, through using subversive measures in our countries, in the West, in Britain, could take us over through perfectly lawful means without firing a bullet, because the peace movements are aiding and abetting their methods. And I will say that the peace movements may be noisy, they may go in for unlawful protests, but they do not represent the vast majority of the electorate in this country, and they have failed to express themselves and win people over at the general election, when people are able to show their feelings in the ballot box. But we do now today, nearly a year onwards from that election, face the fear that there is a moral war upon us, because although we have a strong defense, there are many people who are trying to destroy us by moral disarray, by trading on fear, ignorance, inaccurate information, and of course the statement, as we all know, about Cruise being described as a first strike missile is such unutterable nonsense that I think that their CND are criminal in even mentioning it. The appeasers in this country are the ones who could create a war, who could, at the end of the day, rend us open and weak to the world destruction which Mr. Kuhlman fears. Because they could give a potential enemy, the Soviets, who have a power and a strength and a determination. They have a conventional strength, a nuclear strength far superior to ours. They could give them the temptation to try their luck. The question is, we have to show them that not only do we have the military defenses in the West at a credible minimum level, but we also have the moral resolution, the moral fibre. And I think we need to go back in history to the time when that famous debate took place in Oxford, at the Oxford Union. The King and Country debate followed a time of the First World War when almost a complete generation of men were wiped out in a tragedy. They did not die in vain. They died for freedom. But of course, many people were concerned how to prevent such a tragedy happening again. And the intellectuals arose in the 1920s, like the appeasers in CND, like Bruce Kent, who only day before yesterday in Edinburgh told me in a debate that he was quite honestly a pacifist. I say a horror because that means you are prepared to sacrifice your liberty and your freedom. And this is a very dangerous period, because if you follow that line of thinking, you're following the line of thinking that took place at the time of the debate of King and Country, when many people felt, let us put our trust in the League of Nations. Let us support an international boundaries which could give way to a perfect world. But it failed because of human nature. Human nature has evil stains in it as well as it has much good in it. And it was because that Hitler saw Britain lost its moral fibre that he was tempted and he attacked. And we were weak, we were vulnerable. But where he miscalculated is that Britain rallied and we would fight to the bitter end. And I will say to you today that all you appeasers in this room, should your country be genuinely threatened and you would lose your homes, your freedoms, your children would be threatened. I believe that despite the blackmail damage caused by the CND's campaign of terror, fear, offering easy, slick solutions which can only benefit the Soviets, I believe that the people of this country would once again rise up and fight side by side as they have done for hundreds of years. I do feel very powerfully that you must never underestimate the British Tommy Grit. You may laugh today, but the laugh will be on the other side when you've lost your freedoms, and you will not have the right to sit and laugh because you will be suffering under a totalitarian regime. The laughter will be on the other side of your face. I mean, the good line, dear lady, is to actually, well, I should try again to make this a bit clearer. But the real question is not to laugh about these matters, but to realize what you would lose if you actually were taken over. We have sufficient deterrents here in the West, nuclear and conventional, which we seek all the time to reduce to the lowest, most possible level. I support Mr. Coleman, if only it would be possible in an ideal world to get rid of every single weapon in the world, right the way down to a hammer. We can't. We cannot, because there are other people who would never follow suit. It would be one-sided disarmament, whether you follow the line of one-sided disarmament on nuclear weapons or in any other way. We must maintain our strength. We must keep up these deterrents, despite the pressures put upon the governments by naive and politically minded people who are seeking to destroy us. Yes, people have died in wars. I agree with you. People have suffered tortures to ensure a free world for children. But this is an evil world. There is no safety for you to just to say, lay down your arms. You would not be able to live the life that you wish to live today. It would not be available to you. And I want to warn you, you mustn't fall for the nuclear blackmail that is facing us in the Western world today. It is blackmail, which is what they're trying to do. Even over the Christmas period time, a time of peace and goodwill, the Soviets were deploying more SS-20s. Just think what you would lose if, in fact, you laid down your arms. You would lose the freedoms, and I want you to cast your mind over to perhaps the most vivid symbol in Europe today, which is the Berlin Wall. Why is it that 1,200 people made the effort and risked their lives to get over that wall from the east to the west in 1 year alone? And can you count how many people have voluntarily gone the other way to risk and live a life under totalitarian oppression? Who wants that kind of life? People try desperately to get away to freedom. And when I talk to someone who's like a Czech dissident, like Joseph Josten, who has suffered so much, and he says, you can never know the meaning of freedom until you have lost it. And I think of people like Bukovsky, who have suffered so much, and Kerensky, who is suffering now so much. This is oppression in Russia. This is not what we in Britain want to tolerate in our country. And I want to remind you another thing. Mr. Coleman referred to my name, Olga. It is not a whim of my parents that I was baptized such. My mother is Yugoslav. She has seen her country being taken over by communism. She has seen her family lose their freedoms, their homes, their jobs, because they don't fall in with a totalitarian oppression. And just think what loss of freedoms mean. The loss of freedom means that you cannot choose where you live, how you live, where you work, where you move to. You would have no intellectual freedom. You would have censorship in the press. The press, as a journalist, there is no censorship. And in any case, as a journalist who is often on the other side of the blanket when it comes to being reported upon, I would say that the press is very largely supervised by the left wing in this country. But it's still a press and a free press. And I think that we also...
Look, I don't want to interrupt the flow of the arguments of one of the speakers, but you won't refute the arguments by interrupting now. I've said that there will be ample opportunity for anyone who wants to stand up and address the meeting on any of the points. But you won't do justice to your case by interrupting at this stage, so we'll just wait for the ample opportunity that I shall provide later. Right.
Mr. Chairman, these are the reasons why we want to preserve our liberty, our democracy to vote governments in and out. They can't do that behind the Iron Curtain. They have one candidate in an election, not a variety, nor even candidates for the great Socialist Party of Great Britain. There is no choice. We have that in this country. You can vote any government in or out. It is a great privilege. This is why Britain is worth dying for. And I will maintain that it is always be considered that. And we will never give in to the appeasers who are trying to cause the moral disarray in our society. Our country, from the north of Scotland down to the Channel Islands, is covered with war memorials for reasons that those men died to give us the freedom which we enjoy today, the freedom for you to come here today to listen and even to protest. The last year, in November, I attended the Cenotaph ceremony in Whitehall. It was the largest in years. It's the people who turned up there stretched from Trafalgar Square to Parliament Square. I wonder why. It wasn't exactly an easy day to come out. It was bitterly cold. They came to remember and to remind themselves why people died for us and to ensure that they did not die in vain. Women and families for defence are standing up to you appeasers. We will not allow you to get away with it. Last Easter, tulips were laid on war memorials throughout the country as a very private gesture by the great silent majority to show that Britain is worth dying for, that they have not died in vain, and we care about our liberty, and we will do it again this Easter, and it won't just be restrained to Britain, it will be throughout Europe that the war memorials will be covered in flowers. 1984 is a year of international tension, but we will not give up our own ideals, and we will not allow them to slip away by default, because Britain will never let go of what it has always stood for. We will always fight to the bitter end. Britain, with its great history, its identity, its pride in liberty, freedom and democracy, Mr. Chairman, is well worth fighting for. Thank you.
Right, we're going to have about just under an hour for questions and discussion. But before we go into that period, I'd like to invite one of the organisers of this event, John Howe from the Socialist Party of Great Britain, Islington, just to address you on a few important points about this meeting, and then we'll go straight into questions and discussion.
Well, I have got a few brief announcements. First of all, the most important one, in case you all leave, that is to appeal to your generosity, because the Socialist Party has borne the entire cost of this evening. It amounts to about £200. That's a lot of money for us. We're just ordinary working men and women, and we don't have large sources of funds, trade unions or big corporations. All our money comes either from our own pockets or from the generosity collections at meetings like this. So, if you approve of this sort of activity, and especially if you enjoyed yourselves, it certainly sounded to me sitting there, so you've enjoyed yourselves, then in this case I would ask you to dig as deep as you can in your pockets and give as generously as you possibly can when the members come along round with the collecting tins, trays, baking bowls, or whatever it is we have. Well, thank you very much. Now, there are two other ways in which you can help us. Some of the other members have clipboards. Has anybody got one? They're just to stick it up. Here, there you are. Clipboards at the back. These have two columns. On the right is a column where you can help us enormously by letting us know how you heard about this meeting. Obviously, that's very important to us, and at the very least, it's going to help us to spend more scientifically the very generous contributions that I'm sure you're going to give to us. And on the left-hand side is another column where, if you would like to be sure of hearing about future activities, and we never stop, that you simply put your name and address down, and you'll get on our mailing list, and you'll be certain of hearing about it.
Would you like to pass something?
And what, sorry?
No, sorry, I was
I know Steve can carry farther than that if he wants to, so that shouldn't be surprised. Now, there is a meeting, the next meeting of Islington branch is called From Grunwick to Greenham, and it's held on Thursday the 26th of January, and it's being held in the Prince Albert pub in Walkdale Road. Now that is near King's Cross Station. You'll find it a very good meeting. It's at 8 o'clock. There will be questions and discussion as there are at all of our meetings. So I suggest you go there and burst it open. I think you know what I mean. Now there's another announcement here. Is that any of you who, after listening tonight, feel you would be interested in joining, then I would ask you to come to the members who are attending the stand here, and they will give you any further information that you need on this subject.
Of profit and not need. And we don't want that. But let me say one thing to you very clearly now. I heard my opponent talking about cures for cancer. Do you know that last year the British government, a modest military spender in comparison with the superpowers, spent £1.3 million per hour on the production of armaments. And the Imperial Cancer Research Campaign raised just over £1 million through handing round a begging bowl. I say to my opponent, you hand round a begging bowl for nuclear weapons, let's use the resources to cure cancer.
Correction of both speakers, and I didn't feel it down to the same. I want to announce No.
I'm an Australian, and I'm not prepared to ask for it. It's fun. A lot of people in Norway have died for Britain. A lot of Britons wiped out the Aboriginal race in Australia, and I'd like to know what the ruling class lady has to say about that. Whether the black people of Australia think Britain's worth dying for as well.
I'm delighted to tell you that Australia is totally self-governing. And their policies,
Government in 1975, the government now is the Queen's representative. Now government Australia is independent.
Australia is, as I said, a self-governing country.
Yeah, I appreciate the urgency of your question, but you must allow the speaker that you've asked to answer it. Otherwise, we shan't have time for all of the questions. Right.
In brief, Australia controls its own policies towards the Aboriginal people. I certainly would never support any policy to wipe out any community, black, white, or whatever religious or racial creed they come from. And it is up to the Australian government to take care of their own people in the best possible way, and I'm not aware that they're being wiped out today. There are indeed policies of giving them reserves and certain facilities to say that they can lead their own lives. But Australia has a democracy. People can vote for the method of government that they want best, and I think Australia should be proud of it. I am sorry that you say you're not prepared to die for Britain, because many honourable Australians have done just that, to ensure the free world, which has spread throughout the entire world. And had the Western world fallen in the last war, I doubt whether Australia would have been as free as it is today.
Mainland, there are 50 million people in this country who live below the poverty level. 4 million people haven't even got the opportunity to sell their labour to receive some sort of wage in return. We have over 500,000 people are homeless, yet at the same time there are 1.5 million homes unoccupied in this country. I'd like to ask Maitland, what is your definition of freedom?
My definition of freedom, sir, is in the boroughs where you've got so many homes unoccupied and standing derelict, are in the Labour-controlled councils. And I would suggest that you would express your vote in the right ballot box for the Conservatives, which would ensure that every house which stood empty.
Look.
Well, then you can't complain about not having a home.
Uncivilized, immoral status.
Look, listen to me. You can't sit there and accuse someone of being an animal.
Yes, you are.
You can't sit there and accuse someone
It's a barbarian philosophy.
of being an animal if you attempt to try and refute their arguments by speaking louder than everybody else and not allowing this meeting to proceed in a democratic manner. Now, we're not animals. No one here is an animal, right? So we shall behave like...
Denies steeds from his fellow humans.
I'll ask you one more time to keep quiet, and then I should have to ask you to leave the meeting, because you're disrupting this meeting.
Immoral barbarian.
Right, is there someone please to ask this man to leave? Right. Yes, we'll carry on with the answer first before the next question.
I think we will leave the answer on the point of housing completed on unemployment. Surely now is the time to encourage more profitable industries to rise up so that there will be future employment. And I'm glad to say that in this country, although I shouldn't say so because it's not exactly lawful, that the black economy is alive and well. It's perhaps a strange way of putting it. No one would ever say that unemployment for its own sake is desirable. And I think anyone who is without a job is obviously to be sympathised with in their times of stress. But there is a lot of enterprise in our country, and there is opportunity for enterprise in our country, and I, for one, could do with somebody to come and clean my windows.
Yes, shh. Question from the gentleman at the back.
All views opposed to all governments being now, you are left with you campaign system, according to you, that to prevent war, which surely the short term will guide the system and your argument.
Well, I'll tell you this, you know, it's a very smug question, but a lot of people have died fighting for a system which has allowed us to argue this. wasn't handed to us on a plate. Workers had to fight. People died at Peterloo in Manchester. Our friend there from Australia knows from his own history about the workers who were in Tolpuddle in Dorset who tried to form a trade union before Solidarity was fashionable in the Daily Express. And that's what happened to them. And I would say this, and this is the answer I want to give to you, and it relates to the point that my opponent made about pacifism. We, as a political organisation, have said that we are opposed to dying in wars for capitalism. But of course, when you come to listen to the rhetoric of those who say, even if you're in a majority, well, you're only workers, you're ill-educated, you don't know any better, you're weak-kneed, you haven't learnt your lesson properly, we're going to stop you from having socialism. Socialists aren't pacifists about that, let's make it clear. As far as socialists are concerned, our job is to say that the arms which are at the moment at the disposal of the capitalist class are being used for interests contrary to our own. Our first job is to get hold of those arms by the democratic means of the conquest of the state machine in order to be able to throw away those arms. Because leaving them in the control and under the power of the minority who have them now, the history of the working class, not only Britain, but all over the world, if you study it and if you think about it, the very idea of capitalism, the very idea of this freedom, which millions have died for and been oppressed for and lived in misery for and suffered poverty for, that freedom should stink in the nostrils of the working class. We want to establish freedom, and that is what we're fighting for. And we fight with the most powerful weapon available to us, a weapon which NATO and the Warsaw Pact haven't got an abundance of, and that is a weapon which resides in our head, our brain. And with that, we'll beat them.
Right, that was the next one up there. Yes. Can you speak up, please? It's difficult to hear you.
Take it next.
Finland in 1929 from Prussia invaded from strategic reasons to be prepared for such a war against Germany. America didn't invade Grenada for profit. She invaded because she got down a steel influence.
Well, of course, I mean, what we're talking about is a market. I quite agree with you. You can't put everything down to very simplistic causation. What you have to look at are trade routes, which is really what strategy is about. You have to look at raw materials. You have to look at exploitable populations. Why did the Japanese go to war with China? Because there was a massive potential market. There was a massive potential population to exploit. And why has the Russian ruling class gone into Afghanistan? Partly because of certain natural reserves which are of benefit to them, but also because it's a very important strategic point on the map. And once again, I repeat, I think that whether it's the American ruling class going into Grenada or the Russian ruling class going into Afghanistan, we've got to recognise that people do not take the form of countries. People don't take the form of countries. My opponent may be willing to die for the sake of her passport. I can tell her now, I went abroad last year, I couldn't even afford a passport. I got one of those cheap things that allow you to go away for 6 months. She can have mine. It's run out. I can tell you now, people under capitalism are fighting in wars which are about the control of the market, which as a working class will never have control over. That is the issue. And if what you are trying to do is correct me, then I accept your correction. That, of course, you can't simplistically analyse every capitalist war. What you've got to recognise is that wars within capitalism are about capital and not about wage labour.
I just want to make a short response to that because I disagree with you wholeheartedly. Your own simplistic description of what causes wars today. The wars that have been happening since 1945, and there have been about 150 different conflicts which are broken out across the world. Now, the reason for this is one cause, I reckon, and it's a philosophical one, and it's the Soviet plans for expansion, for dividing and conquering and taking advantage of countries which are weak and vulnerable. And you then have those who will retaliate and respond. You will have those who want to protect the free world. So I maintain that it is not an area of capitalist expansion, although naturally a country may want to use another country for strategic purposes, but it is further to expand their own ideals. And Marxism, Leninism is exactly that. They've said it once, they've said it 1,000 times, and Andropov himself has expounded that their ideal is world domination and control.
Right, question from the man in the green there, and then one at the back. Right.
Chairman, now we've heard a lot from Mrs. Maitland about she has stated dozens of times so far that she is protecting justice, etc. Well, I was born in 1914. In 1939, being a member of the SP at the time, obviously I was well aware of what it was about, in company with many others. Now, I've seen dozens and dozens of members of East London Cyclists who never came back. And I've seen people blown to pieces by bombs. I suspect that Mrs. Maitland has not even experienced this, because what she is advocating is quite easy, you see, to say from a long distance away, we are dropping bombs on them, what Russia doing this. She is advocating extermination of millions of people. And I suspect that she has never even seen the results of what she is talking about. And I'm going to she comes now.
Sir, thank you for those words. I must say I'm very grateful that I didn't have to see those horrific experiences that you saw during the last World War. I am very lucky that I was just a war baby and grew up in a safer world because of the efforts that your colleagues, your friends and your relations put for my benefit to lead a peaceful life today.
And your class?
I am a working class person. I work. You say it is so easy to advocate weapons that for the extermination of millions of people. I agree with everyone that nuclear weapons, which surely you're referring to, are the most appalling horror and terror of today. No one would ever disagree with that. This is why we are all working so hard to bring down a reduction in nuclear arms. And this is why in the West they have worked so hard since the 1970s in withdrawing nuclear weapons one-sidedly. And may I just remind you that in our efforts to reduce this very extermination, during the 1970s, 1,000 nuclear weapons were withdrawn by the NATO alliance. In the next 5 years, another 1,400 will be withdrawn. We are working all the time to bring about a balanced and verifiable reduction in arms, so there will not be that dreadful extermination that you fear, and quite reasonably so.
Can I respond to that and say to you this, that I think that 1 ounce of experience of the kind that you're referring to is worth a great deal more than hours and hours of nationalist rhetoric. It's when you actually see the consequences of the Hiroshimas and the Nagasaki's, which cannot be eliminated from history. They are there, and they are the bloodstains of capitalism, which can't be removed. And I would put it to you this way. Think of the bombing in the store at Harrods a few weeks ago. And nobody in this hall, I think, is going to advocate that the taking away of those human lives, whether they were workers in uniform or other workers, had anything to do with liberation of human beings. Think of that Harrods bombing, 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 times over, with no ambulances to come to the scene, with the hospitals overflowing because they can't deal with the casualties, with the fire brigade at the point where they can't do anything about it. That is a nuclear war, which my opponent talks about in the name of freedom. And that is the experience we've got to apply our minds to. Because it's no good having a cosy debate where capitalism sits on one side and socialism sits on the other, and you make some kind of intellectual judgment. At the end of the day, your judgment comes down to experience. 1 week, 1 month, 1 year from now, are you going to be one of the victims of what would be the greatest Holocaust in history? And if you're not, you've got to do something about it. And I must say I become tired, and I'm sure others here are too, when I hear my opponent say about being a member of the working class, which maybe she is, the National Union of Aristocrats. They've got the biggest pension fund in the world called the House of Lords. But I'd say this, if my opponent is a member of the working class, that doesn't diminish the folly of her argument. It makes it even greater. She's an enemy of her own class.
I will put one short question.
The next three up, one at the back, then the man holding the coat, and then the man over here. Right, in that order, yes, first.
I agree what you say about companies, but how do you try to change the system of control when that system, the capitalist system, is so deeply entrenched, it's so subvert? Like we don't really have a free press, we don't like human can't logically talk to people to change them when they've got so much vested interest in people like that. What do we do? How do we cope with such mould over the issues? What do we do?
It's only by logically talking to people that we are going to change society. They've got immense power on their side. What we've got on our side are numbers, and we've got the ability to think rationally and to overcome the logic of their arguments. And if we don't do that, then they've got us where they want us. Now, what I say to you is this. We've got a meeting in this hall tonight. There are over 300 people here. And I might mention to you that I was at a meeting in this hall during the election. David Owen stood up on this platform, pretty much the same. And what he said didn't amount to much, and it was reported in every daily paper the next morning. What David Owen said to a crowded hall of 200 people in Islington. OK, my opponent wants to die for a free press. Let's see her live for a free press. She works as a correspondent for the Daily Express. They don't believe in censorship. Let's see them prove it. Let's see a full account of what socialists are saying in the Daily Express. Let's hear an account of this meeting. You read your papers tomorrow morning, and I'll tell you this. The state of the press at the moment is such where, as you know, 75% of British newspapers are owned by just 3 companies. That if somebody threw a paper dart at my opponent tonight, they'd make page 6 of the Daily Express tomorrow. I've been talking here all evening. You won't read a word of it. I can guarantee in the Socialist Standard we'll be printing what she said. Best propaganda we've ever had.
Coleman, it may be that I am a mere woman that is causing a bit of comment in the press. And as for a free press, it is a free press which decides what is going to put into the newspaper, what is actually news. I wouldn't like to suggest that you're not news, nor would I like to suggest that I am of any particular interest. And I'm not. It's what I stand for and what I believe in which creates the news. And I think I should also remind you and put you out of your misery about the fear that Fleet Street moguls dominate what exactly goes into the newspapers. One of the great prides in Fleet is that the editors have editorial freedom to control papers. Now, the other thing I should remind you that even on what seemingly seems to you the most right-wing of papers like the Daily Express or even the Sunday Express, which is more right-wing, you ought to look at the staff and talk to them and see how many of them vote and which parties they support. I may say that within the Sunday Express, some of the most professional of the journalists who are even political correspondents are solid supporters of the Labour Party, but that doesn't prevent them from writing a newspaper about news. So I think the answer is learn about newspapers first.
Learn about the Labour Party.
The other thing is, Mr. Coleman, you keep saying to yourself, how are we going to change things? I've got an answer for you. You could vote in the next election for the party of your choice, and they will change things for you. I'd also like to ask you one question. You dream of a world that's free of all these weapons and all these armaments. How are you therefore going to guarantee our security and our liberty and our freedom?
Right, Islington branch has asked me to thank you for a collection of £106, 6.5 pence. And now the next two questions were the man holding the leaflet, then the man with the hat. Next one over here. Right.
I return briefly to the subject of this debate. The British Medical Association report featured in the Sunday Times recently estimated that 2,000 people every year at least die in national health hospitals because of a simple shortage of cash. The only thing that could be written on a death certificate properly was want of money. I'd like to ask Olga Bateman, therefore, did these people die for their country? And if not, who did they die?
Sir, in this country, we have one of the finest health services in the whole world. And I may say that I will never in any way support any death which has happened through shortage of cash. But our National Health Service has had more money spent in real terms today than ever before. And the whole reason, the whole call for reorganising the health service is to ensure that there will be fewer deaths than ever possible, that have happened before because of lack of shortage of cash. Therefore, to reorganise our resources and prevent waste, to ensure more money is spent in the right direction. And this is what we are advocating all the way. And I think we should really encourage careful spending of national health resources rather than supporting wasteful spending on internal catering or laundry services and all the other facilities which could be done at a competitive rate. You talk about arms, madam, but this country wouldn't even have a health service unless we were a properly defended country. And in any case, we spend more money on the health service than almost anything else today, except for education.
I'll take it in a minute.
With respect, I don't think my question was answered. I asked, did they die for their country? If not, who did they die for? I don't think government spending more free and people still dying. This is the British Medical Association. And quite obviously, madam, war is not enough, is it?
But you know, the fact of the matter is, and what you have to recognise in all of this, is that the reason that the National Health Service is there isn't to provide a level of comfort for the working class. The National Health Service isn't there in order to make sure that workers can get the best treatment available. I can tell you now a very quick way to get the best treatment available. You pay for it. You can push to the front of any queue. You can walk into the best hospitals in this country. You can be treated by the best specialists. And you know why? Because we're free. Now feel in your pockets and see how free you are.
I will answer that. A short answer, sir. The only facility that the private medical service provides for you is the fact that they can shorten the waiting period. You, as a national health patient, can see any consultant of your choice. You can have a heart transplant operation on the National Health Service.
Let's over here.
You're parasiting the National Health Service, the private sector. That's why.
Question over here. Then over here, and then you. Well, can you make them fairly brief, please?
Yeah. Well, I would concede that the people that died in the Second World War, or that time in 1066, died for Britain and to protect the British way of life and for freedom. But then serious wars have changed so much right now that the majority of the people that died are actually people that are not fighting in the war. If anything, the soldiers are much more protected right now than the actual population they are fighting to protect, so that you actually get many more people dying in Britain as opposed to the people that are fighting the Russians in West Germany. And since as the wars have changed so much, are those people dying for Britain? I mean, can you actually stand up and say that somebody was in their house while this nuclear bomb exploded over their house and they died for Britain? That's the first question. The second one is the fact that, okay, wars are about protecting your way of life, protecting freedom, and dying for Britain. Britain, if anything, has fought more wars than any other country in the world. And they went, okay, after considering that they fought all these 3 wars that I mentioned for Britain, why did they fight the French in Canada? Why did they fight the Americans? Why did they fight the Africans? Why did they fight the South Africans, who today are their best friends? Why did they fight the Chinese in order to sell opium, which is not even the British way of life? Today are the best people in the world. We must be like the Japanese. I'm not saying that I'm being anti-British, but I'm going to be my third question, which is based on the other side. Okay, it was about fighting for your country, dying for your country, and to protect the way of life in your country. Today, all the problem is what I call propagandists, but what the West calls people that tell the truth, say that the people in Russia are really trying to object to their system of life. But more than 100,000 of them are in Afghanistan right now. And they're keeping the guerrillas in Afghanistan at bay, whereas they're protecting a way of life which the West claims they don't even approve of. Those are the 3 questions I want you to answer me.
Sir, you gave a very passionate exposition, but I'm not quite sure that I totally understood your questions. You did, however, talk about civilians and the fear that civilians would suffer more than the soldiers in the wars. We're talking right at the moment about civilians. The tragedy about all wars is that civilians do get involved. Innocent people remaining at home
holding the fires. Yes, it happened in the last war. It always happens. It's a casualty and it's a tragedy. It's not something I would justify. But there has never been a war in which you could separate the two, unless you go back to the days of the ancient Crusades when the armies went off to fight elsewhere. I agree with you. A nuclear war affects everybody. And this is why we are working so hard to ensure that it doesn't happen. You say that, why fight wars? The answer is we don't want to fight a war, and we're doing all we can to prevent fighting a war. Why do you believe those talks are taking place in Stockholm right now between all the leading countries of the world? It's to prevent war, to keep talking so there is a dialogue, to reduce the tension. And you talk about the enemies of the past and how is it that we're now trading with Japan, and probably this very tape machine here in front of me is Japanese made. I agree with you. One of the strange qualities about humanity is our enemies change. We love them one day and hate them the next. It happens with the Germans. We fought them bitterly and now we are allies. This is human nature. And you now talk about... the world is full of evils, yes, I agree. And it's for that reason that I feel so strongly for those undefended people in Afghanistan who have no means of defending themselves. And the guerrillas do their courageous best trying to defend themselves against all odds. I wonder why they're fighting so hard. It's for their freedom. It's their freedom. They don't want to become part of the Soviet Empire. And how is it that such courageous fights by the terrorists, by the Afghan people are put up against such incredible military odds? What is it that keeps them going? It's because they want to protect their freedom and they're prepared to die for their country. And that's what I'm prepared to do for this country.
Well, when my opponent says that enemies change very quickly, she's absolutely right. As a lot of British workers in uniform on, for example, HMS Sheffield found out when they were blown to pieces with arms which had been sold to the Argentine dictatorship by the government which my opponent supports in the name of freedom, because at the time they found it convenient to do so. Now, Winston Churchill made a very good comment about the Conservative Party. He called it a party of hypocrites. That was when he was in the Liberal Party, before he found out there was more money in being a hypocrite. And I want to put it to you this way. When we come to talk about war, my opponent comes back time and time again. Have you noticed it? And wasn't I right to predict it before she even said a word? To these two words, human nature. Look around you. Take a look at a person sitting next to you and standing next to you. You don't want to kill them. You don't want to resolve arguments as a result of taking up arms to attack people. Even the people who you most bitterly oppose, what is the most ruthless way of defeating them? Put them up there and argue against them. Let them talk and find out what they've got to say, and let people judge them on the basis of their open ideas. And that is why this has got nothing to do with human nature. It's to do with human conditioning. For 40,000 years before the origin of property society in hunter-gatherer communities, there were no armies, there were no wars, there was no institutionalised killing. I'm not suggesting that we return back to those so-called primitive societies. What I would suggest is that you begin to ask the question, what is primitive and what is civilised and what is preferable? And I think that what is preferable is that we take the great technology and skills from so-called civilization and we combine them with our urge for cooperation and solidarity which these days we call primitive and immature. And between them, we can create a society without war. And for my opponent to attribute the psychopathic urges of the warrior to the whole of the human race is a very serious charge. It may indeed get you a commission at Sandhurst, but it's certainly not what being a human being is about. Let's chuck this myth of human nature right out where it belongs, into the dustbin and the Daily Express.
Since 1945, we've been involved in the nuclear arms race. I would like to ask Lady Alder Maitland, there are enough nuclear weapons to blow the world up 16 times over. What advantage does NATO have being able to blow up the world 8.5 times when the Warsaw Pact can only blow it up 7.5 times? There has never been an arms race that hasn't ended in a war.
We are dealing with an arms race which is on one side, and that's on the Warsaw Pact. They have a superiority of conventional weapons, of nuclear weapons, and more importantly, they have another factor. They have the willpower to expand and their frontiers, and this is what we face, is their threat and their intimidation. They do have vast resources beyond ours here in the West, because we prefer to concentrate on social needs. And this is why the NATO alliance is torn apart as to how best to use its resources, and why we have to have nuclear weapons at the level we do have, which we want to reduce, because we're not prepared to spend more money on conventional arms to protect ourselves. But nonetheless, even if we do spend more money on conventional arms and increase our divisions, we are still faced with a threatened intimidation from the Warsaw Pact and Soviet Russia at that, who have a superiority, and they have no intention of reducing their arms one-sidedly. And that is where they're going to remain until we can push and push and push them to reduce their levels.
Can I correct you for sentence information, please, Mr. Chairman? I use the statistics given to us by the US Centre for Defence Information and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, both of which are independent organisations, to say that since 1945 it is the West that have led the arms race, and at the present the West are leading the arms race and are 4 to 5 years ahead technologically and militarily. And our government did not tell us that.
Can I comment on this very briefly and say, look, I'm quite sure everything my opponent says about the Russian dictatorship is right, and everything they say about her government is correct as well. They are both unpleasant, they are both bullies, and they are both involved in trying to terrorise populations in our own interests. And I think that it's very important, and with great respect to you, because I take your first point, please let us not be forced by my opponent into the very dangerous position of saying, look, the government we've got here is so bad, the NATO forces are so obnoxious and awful, that we've got to in fact support the almost or more or equally obnoxious forces of the other side. I have spoken to workers in Moscow and Leningrad, and they've said to me, if only we were living in Britain, if only we were living in a country where you've all got jobs and nice houses and freedom and you can go out and publish a newspaper. Let's chuck out both of those myths, and let's be very, very cautious about supporting either of them. If I didn't have Lady Olga Maitland here tonight, but her echo in Moscow, I'd be saying the same things, I'd be getting the same replies. They are all our enemies, because they're standing for capitalism. And it is a very dangerous illusion. The British Communist Party, which applauded the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945 in the Daily Worker, they fell for that trap. We mustn't. We've got to remember that if we're standing for socialism, we don't stand for any countries, we don't stand for any governments, and tempting though it may be to assume that the enemy of an enemy is a friend The fact of the matter is that the enemy of the ruling class in Britain are the very people who they are doing trade with in Russia, who the Western banks are investing in Poland. Indeed, the reason you had martial law introduced in Poland was at the order of the Western bank, who wanted the repayment of their interest on loans. They're all part of one businessmen's club. We shouldn't be supporting one faction against the other. We should be condemning them all and showing that the working class is bigger than all of them. Because remember one thing, if you put all of the capitalists, all of the dictators, Russians, Americans, Chileans, South Africans on one side, all of those representatives of the capitalist class, and if you put all the workers of the world on the other side, if the workers spat at the capitalists, we'd drown a lot of them.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to say today that I agree it is a working need, because you produce sons. These sons can be free to die for Britain and make sure possibly a lot of other people die for Britain too. What I'd like to ask you on the subject of human nature and the inevitability of it, as you see, is are you prepared to be raped for Britain, molested for Britain, assaulted? Are you happy to have as your ally, as Britain's very close friends, a nation that stuck its hands up Vietnamese women's vaginas and let off grenades as your ally? Is that human nature too?
You ask me about am I prepared to let my sons die for Britain? I am prepared to do whatever I can to ensure a safer world for them. And if you ask me, am I prepared to be raped, molested and assaulted? I have already been molested and assaulted for what I stand for and what I believe. And I will carry on. And I will not duck the challenges, because I passionately believe in a safer world through a freedom and through a democracy which we must not allow to be divided by those appeasers and give a temptation to the Soviets to invade upon ourselves. You make allegations about the Americans in a way which is vulgar and to the extreme. I have no evidence. You have no evidence of these events happening, and I think I can only interpret your comments that the one thing that you're very much against is an alliance with the United States of America. But that alliance, which you so dislike, has supported our freedoms and supported NATO alliance and supported Britain and helped us in the last war and has helped us ever since and is helping us today. And without their backup and their ideals for freedom and democracy, we would not be able to be standing in this room happily and I think cosily talking to each other, where we have the freedom to talk to each other without fear and without a fear of being taken away for saying things which don't support a totalitarian point of view. That is the freedom that I care about.
Right, there's a man with the purple jacket who's been waiting the longest, I think, of everybody. But there's someone been waiting longer than you to speak at the back. Yes, no, behind you. Right.
Very patient.
I'd just like to know how Lady Maitland reconciles so-called love for Britain, or Great Britain, with her desire to destroy it. I mean, they used to talk, our honourable leaders used to talk about us having the right to fight for the defence of our nation. Now, we're expected to lay down and murder it. I mean, it's inconceivable that somebody that loves their country and all the world
I mean, the two things are irreconcilable. You can't support a nuclear war and say that you're fighting for the defence of your country. According to a report that came out of a body of people that was sitting in November, where they programmed computers to see what would happen if nuclear weapons were let off, it was determined that if only 1% of the nuclear arsenals of the world were released, it would be dead for everybody, not just in the northern hemisphere, but in the southern hemisphere as well. Now, where is your love for your country under those circumstances? It's not just our bodies that will die, it is our country that will die, the trees will die, and the sky will die also. Where is God?
Right, it's past 10 o'clock. There is one more question that I'm going to take and invite both speakers to deal with the points raised in their summing up. So I'll ask you to just put this question, and then we have to...
I just want to say something about the mentality Lady Albie Mason supported. A young woman over there asked if she condoned the Americans sticking grenades up women's vaginas and blowing them up. I asked this gentleman the same question. Yes, he said he condoned that. As you were supportive.
Right, you'll appreciate that it's very... Right. Look, I'll have to ask you to sit down.
Hang on.
Yes, I won't shout louder than him. Someone's going to. It's okay. We must retain. We must retain democratic procedures in this meeting. Right. You'll appreciate that it's a difficult task to try and include all of the questions, because particularly towards the end, more people have raised their hand indicating that they'll ask than can possibly fit those in the time by which we have to vacate this building. So I'm going to invite both speakers to sum up their remarks for about 5 minutes each. But before I do that, and the debate is concluded, I'd like to draw your attention to the literature which is available for purchase at the front, a considerable array of it, and to notify you that a large number of the people here will be adjourning afterwards to a pub up the road, the Lord Nelson. That's worth remarking on, should you wish to pursue any of the remarks afterwards. Right. First of all, I'll call upon Lady Olga Maitland to sum up her arguments this evening.
Mr. Chairman, we have heard many thoughts and many opinions. Is Britain worth dying for? And I will say, yet again, emphatically, yes. You ask, or there have been people in the audience who asked just before I rose, how can I reconcile this emphatic yes when we talk about supporting nuclear weapons? Because I agree with you, they are an appalling horror. But the purpose of those weapons is to serve as a deterrent, to prevent the other side, any potential aggressor, from even considering attacking our own homes, our families, and most important of all, the freedom, liberty, and democracy of this country. I just wonder how many people in this room this evening even believe in freedom. There are many young people here who are part of the post-war generation. There are others who are approaching middle age who have no experience of the war that our parents went through. But I will say to you again, and I will remind you, that there is a potential enemy. I believe it to be the Marxist-Leninist philosophy of the Soviets. And I believe that we are at risk unless we show a strength and resolution.
Yes, we do have a military defence, but I believe that that military defence must be matched with something even more important, and that is our moral resolution amongst ourselves to defend our country. There is so much at stake to lose our freedoms. If you think the privileges that you've all had, and I will remind you, the privilege to speak out in public, the privilege to have uncensored newspapers and uncensored press, the privilege of free intellectual thought, the privilege of a democratic vote, the privilege to move and live wherever you wish, the privilege to go abroad, the privilege to choose how you live. If we lived under a totalitarian regime, we would find ourselves subjected to the pressures that we have seen so vividly on television by those brave people in Poland who fight for freedoms within the trade unions. They are the working class, and they care about freedom. I care about freedom. Britain cares about freedom. It always has done. We've never opted out of defending ourselves, and I don't believe this great country of ours will ever opt out, and I don't believe that in the final analysis, when your homes are threatened, when your children are threatened, that you really would lay down your arms and give up and surrender. It has never been the British character, it's never been the British grit, and it never will be. We will always fight to the bitter end. Thank you, sir.
Well, Mr. Chairman, comrades and friends, I want to say first of all that I think, not as a matter of some kind of moral principle, but as a matter of political strategy, that it is important that we heard what my opponent, and I think many of our opponents, had to say in this debate tonight. I think the fact that we heard what she had to say has enabled us to be even more resolute in opposing the very system which she stands for. But at the same time, I think that we as socialists have got to make sure that she's saying that over and over again to as large audiences as possible. And we've got to make sure that we're there to answer it. And that is the only thing that we don't have in the Sunday Express. We can pretty well guarantee that in the next issue of the Socialist Standard or the one after, you'll be able to read what Lady Olga Maitland had to say for herself. And I think that that is important in getting across the fact that this British capitalist system and capitalism throughout the rest of the world, it's not based on some great ideology, it's not based on some great ideas, it's in fact based upon political rhetoric which, when scratched at the surface, turns into nothing but the defence of class, greed and plunder in the name of freedom. And when my opponent says that Britain has never opted out, does she not know that in the early 1930s the British government were having consistent intelligence reports coming out of Germany about the establishment of concentration camps, about hundreds of thousands and later millions of Jews and trade unionists being sent into the gas chambers, being put into forced labour camps? What did the British government do? Don't talk to me about opting out. The British government at the moment and the leading British banks and multinational companies have all today got large office blocks in Moscow and Leningrad. What are they doing there? They're investing their money in the cheap labour power of the non-unionised Russian and East European working class. And that's what the banks were doing in Poland, investing billions of dollars because there was cheap labour on which they could get a high return. That's why workers in Poland are suffering as they are now. Nothing at all to do with socialism. When my opponent says British people have never been forced to fight, and somebody shouted out, what about conscription? What about the Socialist Party members who were stuck in prison during world wars because they refused to go and fight? I put this question. She talks about Christmas and the season of peace and goodwill. In Christmas, in 1916, a group of British soldiers were lined up and shot to set an example to the rest of the regiment who refused to fight in a war that they didn't want to fight in. And it was only because those men were shot that the rest of them were compelled to go into battle. That is the compulsion and coercion upon which British military rule has been based. And when my opponent says that if we lose our freedom, we won't be able to choose where to live. How many of you could choose where to live? She says we won't be able to choose where we work. How many of you could choose where you work? I'd do a job on the Daily Express, the gossip columnist. The fact of the matter is that when it comes to it, we're living in a society where the basic freedom of access to what we need, food in the case of 30 million people who starve to death every year, and I said at the beginning, that was one Hiroshima every 2 days. Let that statistic be impressed upon everyone's minds. Let's by all means go and watch films called The War Game, which the BBC, because we're a free country, banned and wouldn't let you watch. Let's go and watch The War Game and see what Hiroshima and Nagasaki were like. Let's also remember, every 3 days, the equivalent of the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki deaths occur by people starving to death, surrounded by stockpiles of food, guarded very often by army officers in India and Pakistan. Is that the freedom of capitalism which he's asking us to defend? The freedom to work where we like, when in Britain 4 million people, in America something like 11 million people can't get a job? Is that the freedom for which we're supposed to be fighting? I conclude by asking a question, and I'm not going to try to answer it.